This is Glenn Fulcher with another issue of Language Testing Bytes. Welcome to issue 32 of Language Testing Bytes. Volume 37, issue 4 of the journal is a special on repeated test taking and longitudinal test score analysis. Now, this is a topic that frequently crops up on discussion lists like LTestL, and not surprisingly, as many teachers and learners as well as test researchers want to know what happens to test scores over time. While we hear lots of anecdotal advice about this, there is little of substance that helps stakeholders understand what's going on. That is, until now. We welcome Professor Tony Green from Crella at the University of Bedfordshire to the podcast, who edited this special issue along with Ali Van Moor. Tony, welcome to Language Testing Bytes, and thanks for talking to all our listeners about this topic, which seems to generate endless interest among so many language testers, teachers and learners.
Hi Glenn, I'm really happy to be here doing my first Language Testing Bytes podcast, and I do hope the listeners are going to find this topic just as fascinating as Ali and I did.
Well, to start the ball rolling, can you tell us what repeated test taking is?
Okay, so repeated test taking is, obviously enough, taking a test on more than one occasion. But it doesn't include taking different tests. So, for example, if you take a language test, then a history test, then a maths test, that's not what we're talking about. And it doesn't involve taking even different language tests. So if you were to take a Pearson test on Monday, a TOEFL test on Tuesday, an IELTS test on Wednesday, that wouldn't be the kind of thing we're talking about either. I should also say it doesn't necessarily mean taking exactly the same test with all the same questions. It could be a different form or a different version of the same test. But where the tests are different, where there are different questions, different tasks, they would have to have been equated or linked in some way, so there's a known relationship between them. Of course, as we make clear in the special issue, although it is currently very much a focus of attention, repeated testing is not something new. It's probably been around and with us for just as long as we've had tests.
You say that this phenomenon is far from recent. Can you just give us a couple of examples to illustrate the extent of repeated test taking, both in terms of history and just how many test takers might be involved today?
Yeah, so in the special issue, we give the example of the people who would spend a lifetime working their way up through the Chinese civil service examinations, which date back, over 1,000 years anyway. Those examinations were held every 2 or 3 years and were incredibly selective. So sometimes 50,000 people would compete for just, say, 1,000 degrees. And there are accounts of people spending their entire lives taking these exams again and again, and still trying even into their 90s. But as to how many people today are test repeaters, it's actually pretty difficult to say because it's not something that is consistently published by test providers. There's a TOEFL report by Yanling Zhang in 2008, which told us that maybe 10% of TOEFL test takers were repeating at least once. But the rates are bound to vary according to the nature of the particular test we're talking about and things like how easy it is to repeat, what sort of administrative arrangements are in place for people to take the test again.
But it's clear from your summary that this is a very significant activity. Can you now say a little bit about the importance of repeated test taking as a social phenomenon? I mean, how is it used?
So I'd say there are different viewpoints, different perspectives on this for different groups of stakeholders. So for test takers, there are quite a few reasons you might want to take a test again. One is very much instrumental, about getting access to opportunities. So if you haven't succeeded in passing a test at the first opportunity, you might want to try it again to get a job or to get into university or to get a visa. And taking the test again might be seen the same way as another roll of the dice, taking a chance. Or perhaps it could be seen as something more formative. You've taken the test, you've seen where you were successful, where you were less successful. You want another opportunity to have another go, see if you can perform better, learn your lessons from the first time you took the test. So there are implications there maybe for learning and for how you can improve. For some learners, it can be a way of keeping track of their learning. So after a given period of study, you take the test again, and then you have some kind of hard evidence that your ability has improved. And that tracking function is going to be of interest to a second group of stakeholders. So people like educational managers or researchers or sponsors of learners, people like their parents or employers who've invested in something in that person's learning, and they want to know that their money has been well spent, or that the education system is functioning well, and that's improving the individual's abilities, or maybe it's improving the abilities of a group of people. So an important use of repeat test administration would be to build up understanding of learning trajectories. And then there are testing agencies. So in economic terms, obviously testing agencies benefit if people are taking their tests more than once. So it looks good. So more test taking, more revenue. But on the other hand, it can also be something of a threat to testing agencies. They may have to take measures to protect the test, because when people take the test more than once, they've seen some of the questions. Those questions may come up again. There's sort of exposure of the item bank. So they may need to produce more questions to protect against people knowing what the questions might be, making it less predictable for the test takers. So they might need to take some steps, such as increasing test security, producing more questions, greater volume of test material, steps to make the test material less predictable, so you have different kinds of questions that are going to come up on different occasions. They may have to limit the opportunities for repeats, so keep track of who's taken the test and make sure that they don't take the test again within a certain period of time. And maybe measures to prevent very predictable kinds of responses in their scoring systems. So there can be costs involved for the testing organisations as well as benefits.
So one of the issues that might arise is whether it's possible to reliably measure language proficiency over time. For example, to get evidence of acquisition or to investigate the parallel nature of forms where test takers may encounter different test content on different administrations. And I suppose that these two may also interact. I mean, what are the reliability issues at stake in repeated test taking?
Again, reliability is something of a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, reliability is partly a function of the number of observations. So we know that the more items we have on a test, the sharper the focus we can achieve on the ability that we're testing, and the more reliable the results are going to be. So assuming that we've got items that are generally of good quality, a 200 item test is going to give us more reliable scores than a 100 item test. So if we got somebody to repeat a 100 item test, effectively we have a 200 item test, and the results from the repeated measures are going to be more reliable than from a single test event. So if we want a reliable picture of somebody's language abilities, then getting them to take the test a number of times seems like a good idea. On the other hand, if we're trying to measure how much people improve their abilities over time, then we have a different issue, because the unreliability or the error involved in the two tests will be increased when we come to look at the difference between the two test scores, because the difference score between the two will be affected by the level of reliability of the first test and the level of reliability of the second test. So as an indication of how much improvement people have made, the difference between the two scores is likely to be very unreliable. So it might be quite suitable when we're looking at large numbers of people, because the error will be smoothed out over the group. But if we're looking at individuals and trying to treat a difference between two scores as an indication of how much they've improved, we have a very unreliable kind of measure.
Are there any technical innovations in the 21st century that make the intentions behind repeated test taking easier than in previous centuries?
One thing that's really changed is how easy it is to take a test. So the delivery of tests is now much easier than it used to be. So tests can be delivered using technology. They can be delivered more often and more easily. It's now as easy as picking up your mobile phone and you can take a test. Whereas in The situation in China used to have to travel to a provincial test centre in order to be able to take the test, and it could only happen every few years, whereas now you can finish one test event and in many cases you could immediately start another as soon as you finish the first. So it's much easier now to take tests than it used to be and to administer them. It's also much faster and more efficient to score tests. So with automated scoring, especially if a test is done on computer or online, you can get almost instant results. So that encourages people then to think about repeat test taking, because they can immediately see whether they've got the result they need or the result they expect or the result they aspired to after the first testing event. There are other factors to do with making connections between different versions of the test. So working from large item banks, we can create lots of different forms or versions of a test in a relatively short space of time. And that makes it easier again for us to allow for people to take tests repeatedly. In terms of some of the interpretations of test results, so in the special issue we bring up a number of the statistical innovations that have helped us to look at patterning in development of test scores over time. So there are papers on multi-level modelling, Bayesian modelling and latent growth curve modelling that show some of the new techniques we have for looking at how we might analyse the development of abilities over time using repeated test taking.
This volume of the journal contains papers that make a very significant contribution to the debate about repeated test taking. Now, unfortunately, we just don't have the time to discuss each individually. Would you be able to take us through just a few of the key issues that they raise so that we can whet the appetite of our listeners to read them all?
Okay, well, Ali and I picked out a couple of themes from the papers in the special issue that we think make a really compelling case for people giving more attention to the issue of repeat test taking when they make a validation argument supporting use of a test. One is that repeated test taking can improve our interpretation of test scores because it leads to these improvements in reliability and potentially allows us to get better insights into people's learning trajectories and how quickly they seem to be improving their language abilities. So there are papers in the special issue that look at different methodologies and different perspectives on these questions, with insights into the influences on score improvements and into which features of language might change over time. And there are implications there for second language acquisition as well as for education. So some of those features might be static, things like learners' proficiency at the time they took the first test. But others are more dynamic. There are things that change. So there's the change in the learner's proficiency between the first test and the second test. There's change in language use at home. So are they mainly using, if they're migrating to a new country, are they mainly using their language of the country they're coming from, or are they mainly using the language of the country they're moving to at home? So researchers in the issue looked at the duration between test events, effects of different kinds of practice, differential growth in skills, changes in the context, environmental changes, as well as patterns in the changes in test performance. A second theme that we picked out centres around the implications for test use and kind of consequences that can flow from repeated test taking. And we see some positive consequences, so there are great formative possibilities in repeat test taking. If the first test can point to areas of strength and weakness, it can give the learner ideas about where they need to focus their attention in order to improve their abilities. It also helps communication. So if you think about people who are advising learners or parents about how much progress they're making, that repeat test taking and some of the new techniques that we're looking at can help to ease those conversations by showing how we build up a fuller picture of people's ability over time by taking into account tests that they've taken in the past. But we also thought there were a few areas where we had some concerns. So because of the influence of measurement error and the opportunities that are there for people to do repeat test taking, there's now a phenomenon called superscoring, where test takers may take a test a number of times, and if it's made up of a number of subtests, say there's a test of writing, speaking, reading and listening, they can bank their scores as they go along. So they do particularly well on writing on the first occasion, they keep that score. On the second occasion they do very well on reading, they keep that score, and they put those scores together to give them an overall higher profile in terms of their results. We think that has some worrying implications for equity, because taking tests, especially high stakes tests, is an expensive business. So it may exclude less wealthy test takers from being able to do this, take this super scoring strategy. And it allows people perhaps to exploit the beneficial impact of measurement error on their scores if they have the resources to be able to do that. We're also a little bit worried about the idea that repeated test taking may not only have formative impact, that it encourages people to focus on the skill areas that they need to work on, but also on finding ways to crack the test, or to show their abilities, or to give the impression that they have abilities that they don't really have by exploiting features of the test design. And the more often they're able to do the test, the more often they're able to find the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities in the test design that they might be able to exploit. And one of the papers in the special issue does focus very much on the ways in which individual test takers use different strategies to try to improve their scores over time. So I think we see both potential benefits and potential risks in relying increasingly on repeated test taking in building up our picture of what test takers are able to do. But we think very clearly this is the trend, and that we're going to see more repeated test taking happening over time.
It's clear that this is a very timely volume and will make a very significant contribution to opening up the debate on what has been, until now, very under-researched. Thanks for talking to us on Language Testing Bytes, and I hope that our listeners will rush off and download the special issue papers to investigate further.
Well, thank you very much, Glenn. It's been a real pleasure. I hope that what I've been saying has encouraged people to download the special issue and to read the papers and to build up their own understanding of what repeated test taking is all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this issue of Language Testing Bytes. Language Testing Bytes is a production of the journal Language Testing from Sage Publications. You can subscribe to Language Testing Bytes through iTunes, or you can download future issues from ltj.sagepub.com or from languagetesting.info. So until next time, we hope you have enjoyed the current issue of Language Testing Bytes.